For 3 years, the Blackridge Gang had ruled the high plains of Montana with an iron fist. Through theft, intimidation, and strategic land grabs, they'd built a criminal empire that left desperate homesteaders and broken dreams in their wake. But on a snow-laden winter night, beneath the shadow of the Eagle Mountains, they made a grievous error in judgment that would echo through the criminal underworld for years to come. They burned down Evelyn Harrow's ranch. They saw what they wanted to see: a 43-year-old widow living alone on a valuable piece of land that controlled the only reliable water source for miles around. An easy target to intimidate into selling her strategic property before the railroad survey was completed. What they failed to recognize was the patient calculation behind her steel blue eyes. The same patience that had once made her the most renowned tracker and hunting guide in 3 territories before she settled down. The woman who'd stalked and taken down 26 mountain lions across the northern Rockies without ever missing a shot. The hunter that forest rangers and settlers alike called Ghost Walker for her ability to move unseen through the wilderness, leaving no trace of her passage. Now standing amidst the smoldering ruins of her home, Evelyn gazed at the destruction with an expression that would have terrified the Blackridge Gang had they remained to witness it. The carefully built life she'd created with her late husband Robert, reduced to ashes and charred timber. Their dream of a peaceful ranch where they could eventually grow old together, now nothing but smoke rising into the winter sky as snowflakes began to fall, melting instantly as they touched the still hot embers of her home. Evelyn knelt and picked up a partially burned photograph, the only one she had of Robert. His kind eyes looked back at her from behind the scorched edges of the frame. She tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. Sometimes vengeance requires patience. Sometimes justice demands tracking your prey to the perfect moment. And the Blackridge Gang was about to learn why even the most hardened frontiersmen still spoke Evelyn Harrow's name with quiet respect. The dawn light painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and gold as Evelyn moved through the dense forest with silent precision. Her breath formed small clouds in the December air, but her movements remained steady and deliberate, each footstep placed with the care of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the language written in disturbed leaves and broken twigs. 3 days had passed since the destruction of her ranch, 3 days of careful preparation, while she established a temporary camp in a hidden valley known only to her, a place she and Robert had discovered during their first year on the frontier. The small cave, concealed behind a curtain of pine branches and overlooking a narrow ravine, had served as an emergency shelter during sudden blizzards when they'd ventured too far from home on hunting trips. Now it served as Evelyn's base of operations. Inside the cave, Evelyn had assembled what she'd managed to salvage from the ruins of her home, along with supplies she'd kept hidden in various caches throughout her property. A precaution Robert had initially considered excessive, but had eventually embraced. Her husband had been a gentleman, a former schoolteacher from Boston who'd come west seeking adventure and a fresh start after the war. He'd found both in Evelyn. Evelyn checked the action on her Sharps rifle, the weapon almost an extension of herself after 20 years of reliance on its precision. Robert had called it Judgment as a joke, never imagining the name would one day become so fitting. The rifle had been a gift from her father, who taught Evelyn to hunt when she was barely tall enough to shoulder the weapon. A woman alone needs to be twice as capable, her father had told her, words that had shaped her life on the frontier. By 15, she could outshoot most men in the territory. By 20, her tracking skills had become legendary, leading to a decade of work as a guide for wealthy hunters from the East and Europe who sought trophies and adventure in the Montana wilderness. That was how she'd met Robert, a scholarly man accompanying his wealthy cousin on a hunting expedition. While the cousin had been interested only in conquering the wilderness, Robert had been fascinated by it, and even more fascinated by the quiet, competent woman who moved through it with such grace. Evelyn smiled at the memory as she placed the Sharps carefully on a deerskin cloth. Beside it, she arranged her hunting knives, each honed to razor sharpness. A Winchester repeater, her second choice for situations requiring multiple shots, leaned against the cave wall next to a Colt Peacemaker that had once belonged to Robert. He'd barely known how to use it, but Evelyn had insisted he carry it whenever he ventured into town alone. If only he'd had it with him that final day. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself 5 seconds of grief before compartmentalizing the emotion away. The Blackridge gang had given her too many reasons to mourn already. Now it was time for other matters. She opened a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful notes and observations gathered over the months since the gang had first appeared in Pinewood County. Evelyn had been tracking their movements, even before they'd become a direct threat. Her hunter's instincts recognizing predators moving into her territory. The Blackridge gang had started small, road agents robbing the occasional stagecoach or lone traveler. But under the leadership of Nathan Blackridge, they'd grown bolder, more organized. They began targeting ranches and homesteads along the proposed railroad route, using intimidation and violence to force owners to sell their land for a fraction of what it would be worth once the railroad came through. Sheriff Tanner in Pinewood Falls had been useless, either too afraid or too corrupt to challenge the gang. When Robert had gone to him with evidence of the gang's activities, the sheriff had dismissed his concerns, suggesting that city folk like Robert should mind their own business if they wanted to survive on the frontier. 2 weeks later, Robert was dead, his body found at the bottom of a ravine where his horse had apparently panicked and thrown him. A tragic accident, according to Sheriff Tanner. But Evelyn had examined the scene herself. The signs had been subtle but unmistakable to someone with her skills. Signs of a struggle. Boot prints that didn't belong to Robert. Marks on the rocks that couldn't have been made by a simple fall. Someone had made it look like an accident, but they hadn't counted on a wife who could read the story written in disturbed soil and broken branches. After Robert's death, Evelyn had withdrawn into watchful silence, becoming the grieving widow the town expected, while secretly documenting the gang's movements and operations. Her cover as a simple rancher's widow had served her well. No one suspected that behind her quiet demeanor lay a mind assembling every piece of information about the Blackridge gang. Their hideouts, their patterns, their strengths and weaknesses. Nathan Blackridge had become increasingly fixated on acquiring Evelyn's land over the past 6 months. The natural spring on her property was the only reliable year-round water source for miles, making it invaluable for both ranching and the coming railroad. It started with offers to buy, insultingly low figures, delivered by his smooth-talking brother, James Blackridge. When Evelyn refused, the intimidation began. Fences cut, cattle stampeded, warnings delivered by nervous townsfolk who claimed to be concerned for a woman alone. None of it had worked, so they'd escalated to destruction, burning her ranch to the ground while she was in town purchasing supplies, leaving nothing but a crude note nailed to a charred beam. "Reconsider our offer. Next time you'll be inside." They thought they were sending a message. In reality, they were releasing a predator they hadn't known existed. Evelyn turned the pages of her journal, reviewing what she knew about the gang's main members. Nathan Blackridge, the leader, former cavalry officer. Dishonorably discharged after the war for excessive brutality against civilians. Intelligent, methodical, dangerous. Preferred weapon, cavalry saber and Remington revolver. James Blackridge, Nathan's younger brother, the public face of their operation, handling business dealings and negotiations. Less violent than Nathan, but equally ruthless. Rumored to have killed 3 men in Helena over a card game, though nothing was proven. Elijah Crow, the tracker, a half-Cherokee scout who turned against both worlds. Skilled in the wilderness, though Evelyn had observed flaws in his technique. Too reliant on obvious signs, not patient enough for the subtle ones. The Harris brothers, Curtis and William, former cattle rustlers from Wyoming, the muscle of the operation. Vicious, not particularly bright, but dangerous in a fight, and at least 7 other men, drifters and criminals, drawn to the promise of easy money and the protection of the gang. 12 men total, 12 targets. Evelyn knew she couldn't take on the entire gang directly. Even with her skills, those weren't odds any sensible hunter would accept. But a wolf didn't attack a buffalo herd head-on. It isolated the vulnerable, picked them off one by one, created chaos and weakness before striking at the heart. She would do the same. Evelyn closed her journal and moved to the cave entrance, looking out over the winter landscape. The sun had fully risen now, glinting off snow-covered pines and casting long shadows across the valley. In the distance, she could just make out the smoke rising from Pinewood Falls, the small settlement that served as the nearest town to her destroyed ranch. The gang would be celebrating their successful intimidation, believing Evelyn would now be desperate to sell what remained of her property and flee the territory. Their assumption would give her the time she needed. Evelyn returned to her preparations, assembling small pouches of supplies that she could carry easily when tracking. Jerky, dried fruit, hardtack, matches wrapped in oilskin, basic medical supplies, ammunition. A hunter preparing for an extended expedition. As she worked, Evelyn's mind returned to the last conversation she'd had with Robert before his death. They'd been sitting on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "You know what Sheriff Tanner told me today?" Robert had said, his voice tight with indignation. He said sometimes the wisest course is to bend with the wind rather than stand against it, that I should consider Blackridge's offer before things get unpleasant. "And what did you tell him?" Evelyn had asked, though she already knew the answer. For all his gentle scholar's demeanor, Robert had possessed a stubborn streak when it came to matters of principle. "I told him that some things are worth standing firm against the wind," Robert had replied, reaching over to take her hand. "This land, what we've built here together, it means something. It's not just dirt and trees and a house. It's a future we've made. I won't let men like Blackridge take that away just because they're willing to use force to get what they want." The memory tightened Evelyn's throat. They'd built their ranch together, a seamless partnership despite their different backgrounds. Robert had learned to hunt, to build, to survive in the wilderness. She had learned to read, to appreciate poetry, to see beauty in the world through his eyes. Together, they'd created something that belonged uniquely to them. And now it was gone, burned to ash by men who saw the land only as something to be exploited, who measured worth solely in dollars and power. Evelyn had spent the day after the fire in Pinewood Falls, playing the role everyone expected, the devastated widow seeking sympathy and support. She'd stayed at the boarding house run by Martha Wilson, a kind woman who had been one of the few genuinely friendly faces when Evelyn and Robert had first arrived in the territory. "You can stay as long as you need, Evelyn," Martha had told her, patting her hand across the dining table. "No one would blame you for selling what's left and heading back east after this. It's no place for a woman alone." Evelyn had nodded gratefully, maintaining her facade of vulnerable grief while gathering valuable information through careful questions and attentive listening. She'd learned that the Blackridge gang was planning a major operation in 3 days, something involving a shipment coming through Oakwood Pass. The details weren't clear, but it was important enough that most of the gang would be involved. That information had solidified Evelyn's initial strategy. She would begin by understanding their operation better, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities before starting to eliminate targets of opportunity. The remote location of Oakwood Pass would provide her first chance to observe the gang in action without the complications of witnesses or the constraints of civilization. Evelyn finished her preparations as the winter sun climbed higher in the sky. She dressed in layers, wool and buckskin chosen for warmth and silent movement rather than appearance. A fur-lined coat that reached her knees, gloves with the fingertips removed for better dexterity when shooting, boots wrapped with strips of cloth to muffle her footsteps and leave minimal tracks. Finally, she pulled her dark hair back and secured it tightly, then covered it with a soft leather hat. The transformation was complete. No longer the respectable rancher's widow, but the hunter she had been before settling down with Robert. Evelyn stepped out of the cave and scanned the horizon. Oakwood Pass was a day's journey northwest through difficult terrain, made more challenging by the recent snowfall. She would need to leave immediately to reach a suitable observation point before the gang arrived for whatever operation they had planned. She shouldered her pack and rifle, then paused for one final look at the small camp that now contained everything she owned in the world. The cave would remain her base until her work was finished. After that, Evelyn pushed the thought away. There would be time to consider the future after justice had been served. For now, there was only the hunt. And unlike the mountain lions and wolves she had tracked in years past, this prey had made a critical mistake that would prove fatal. They had attacked her home, destroyed what she loved, and then turned their backs, believing her harmless. Evelyn Harrow set off toward Oakwood Pass, moving through the winter forest like a shadow, leaving barely a trace of her passage. The first phase of her hunt had begun. The Pinewood Falls Saloon pulsed with raucous energy despite the bitter cold that had settled over the Montana territory. Piano music battled against drunken laughter and the clinking of glasses as Nathan Blackridge claimed his usual table in the corner, the one positioned to give him a clear view of both entrances while keeping his back to the wall. Old cavalry habits died hard. "To progress," Nathan said, raising his glass in a mock toast to his brother James, who sat across from him, looking considerably more refined in his tailored suit and neatly trimmed beard. Another obstacle removed. James nodded, though his expression revealed a hint of distaste. Was burning the entire property necessary? We need that land intact, particularly the water access. The land remains intact, Nathan replied, his voice carrying the hard edge that had made men instinctively step back during his military days. The structures can be rebuilt, better ones, once the railroad contract is secured. He drained his whiskey. Besides, fear is an effective motivator. The Harrow widow will sell now. At the bar, Curtis Harris slammed down his empty glass, demanding another from the nervous bartender. His brother William was engaged in what appeared to be unwanted attention toward one of the saloon girls, his meaty hand gripping her wrist despite her attempts to pull away. "Your dogs need a shorter leash," James observed quietly, nodding toward the Harris brothers. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly. They serve their purpose. And when their purpose becomes a liability... The threat hung unfinished in the air. James straightened his cuffs, a deliberate gesture that showcased the gold cufflinks he'd acquired from a banker in Helena, who'd made the mistake of refusing the Blackridge's business proposition. "Curtis nearly beat that surveyor to death last month. We need information from those men, not corpses. Fear and respect are built on justified violence," Nathan replied, running his thumb along the scar that bisected his left cheek, a souvenir from his cavalry days. "The territory understands that language better than your fancy contracts." The saloon doors swung open, bringing a blast of cold air and the imposing figure of Elijah Crow. Snow dusted the shoulders of his buckskin jacket, melting rapidly in the saloon's heat as he made his way directly to the Blackridge's table. His dark eyes scanned the room in one sweeping glance, cataloging every patron, every potential threat, before he spoke. "Sheriff's heading this way," he said, his voice low and graveled. "Just left his office." Nathan nodded, unsurprised. Sheriff Tanner was as predictable as he was corruptible. "Right on schedule. James, remind our good sheriff about his monthly consideration." James patted the inside pocket of his suit jacket, where an envelope contained twice the lawman's usual salary, already prepared. "Though he may require additional reassurance after the Harrow incident." "Then provide it," Nathan said dismissively. "Crow, any sign of the widow?" "Staying at the Wilson boarding house," Crow replied, settling into a chair and signaling to a barmaid for whiskey. "Spent the morning at the general store buying supplies. Basic necessities. Nothing unusual." "Unusual would be concerning," James noted. "Normal behavior suggests a woman in shock, not one planning retaliation." Nathan scoffed. "Retaliation? From a schoolteacher's widow?" The woman spent her days tending chickens and mending fences. Crow accepted his whiskey from the barmaid, but didn't drink immediately. Instead, he turned the glass slowly between calloused fingers. There's something about her tracks? Both Blackridge brothers looked at him sharply. Explain, Nathan demanded. Checked the property after the fire. Crow continued. Found her tracks in the snow when she returned to discover the damage. They were... He paused, searching for the right word. Deliberate. Controlled? Even in a moment of shock. James leaned forward, suddenly interested. You believe she has some training? Crow shrugged. Different from most settler women I've tracked. Lighter impression than expected. Careful foot placement. Nathan dismissed the concern with a wave. The woman lived on a remote ranch for years. Of course she learned to walk in the snow without falling on her face. He refilled his glass from the bottle on the table. She'll approach James within the week, desperate to sell what's left before winter fully sets in. Another piece of the puzzle secured. The saloon doors opened again, admitting Sheriff Tanner, whose florid face and substantial belly spoke of a man who enjoyed the privileges his position afforded him. He removed his hat as he approached the Blackridge's table, revealing thinning gray hair plastered to his scalp. Gentlemen, he greeted, his forced joviality barely masking his nervousness. Mighty cold evening to be out and about. Join us, Sheriff, James offered with practiced charm, sliding a chair out with his foot. A drink to ward off the chill. Tanner settled his considerable bulk into the offered chair. Don't mind if I do. His eyes darted between the brothers. Heard about the unfortunate fire out at the Harrow place. Terrible business indeed. Tragic how quickly a fire can spread in these dry conditions. Even with the snow, James agreed, pouring whiskey for the sheriff. A stove left unattended, perhaps? Tanner accepted the drink and the implied narrative in a single motion. Yes, very dangerous. I'll be sure to note that in my report. He cleared his throat. The widow Harrow seems quite distraught, naturally. Been asking questions about how long an investigation might take. Nathan's expression hardened. And what did you tell her? That with winter setting in and limited resources, a thorough investigation would be challenging until spring. Tanner replied, attempting to project authority despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Suggested she might be better off returning east to family rather than rebuilding alone. Sound advice, James said smoothly, sliding the envelope across the table with such subtlety that it seemed to appear under the sheriff's hand by magic. These frontier territories are no place for a woman without protection. Tanner made the envelope disappear with equal skill. My thoughts exactly, though she doesn't strike me as the type to scare easily. Crow looked up at this, his interest piqued. What type does she strike you as, Sheriff? He asked. Tanner shrugged. Hard to say. Quiet. Watchful. Not weeping and wailing like you might expect. Her husband was the talkative one, always going on about land rights and proper legal channels. He snorted. Lot of good that did him. Nathan shot a warning glance at the sheriff, who immediately realized his mistake. I mean, terrible tragedy, his accident. Tanner amended hastily. Ravine's been dangerous for years. Keep meaning to put up warning signs. James smoothly redirected the conversation. Sheriff, we've heard rumors about increased federal marshal activity near Oakwood Pass. Any truth to that? Tanner seemed grateful for the change of subject. Nothing official crossed my desk, but the stage driver mentioned seeing riders that matched the description. Something about investigating missing shipments. Nathan and James exchanged significant looks. Timing is problematic, James noted carefully. Coincidental, Nathan countered, though his expression had darkened. Crow drained his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate precision. There's no such thing as coincidence in a territory this empty. The conversation paused as the saloon doors opened once more, admitting a blast of cold air and a woman who seemed out of place in the rough establishment. Evelyn Harrow stood in the doorway for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room until it settled on the table in the corner. Speaking of the widow, Tanner muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Evelyn moved through the crowded saloon with quiet determination. her practical clothes still bearing traces of soot. Whether by circumstance or design was difficult to determine. The noise in the establishment diminished as heads turned to watch her progress. Women rarely entered the saloon, and certainly not unaccompanied widows whose properties had just mysteriously burned down. Nathan straightened, his right hand instinctively moving closer to his holstered revolver. James, ever the diplomat, stood as Evelyn approached their table. "Mrs. Harrow," he greeted with practiced sympathy, "please accept our condolences for your recent misfortune. May I offer you a chair?" Evelyn regarded him with a cool assessment. "Mr. Blackridge," she acknowledged, ignoring the offered seat. "I understand you've been interested in purchasing my property." James blinked, momentarily taken aback by her directness. "Well, yes. Our business consortium has made several offers, though perhaps this isn't the appropriate time." "It seems exactly the appropriate time," Evelyn interrupted, her voice steady, "since there's little left standing to negotiate over." The saloon had gone almost completely silent, every ear straining to catch the exchange. Nathan remained seated, studying Evelyn with narrowed eyes, while Crow observed her with newfound intensity, noting the way she had positioned herself, close enough for conversation, but maintaining a distance that would give her reaction time if threatened. Sheriff Tanner cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harrow, perhaps we should discuss your property situation in my office tomorrow, with proper legal consideration. I think we can dispense with pretenses, Sheriff." Evelyn cut him off without looking in his direction. Her focus remained on James Blackridge. "I'm here to understand exactly what your final offer is, Mr. Blackridge, now that circumstances have evolved." James recovered his composure quickly, professional charm sliding back into place. "Of course, given the changed nature of the property, we'd be prepared to offer $3,000, a generous figure considering the current state of the structures." $3,000, Evelyn repeated, her expression unreadable. "For a property with the only reliable year-round water source within 20 miles of the planned railroad junction." Nathan leaned forward. "The railroad hasn't confirmed their exact route yet, Mrs. Harrow. $3,000 is more than fair for burned timber and scorched earth." Evelyn turned her attention to him for the first time, and something in her steady gaze made Nathan's hand twitch closer to his gun. "I'm familiar with fair market value, Mr. Blackridge," she replied. "Just as I'm familiar with the tactics men like you use when fair offers are rejected." The implied accusation hung in the air. Crow watched the exchange with growing fascination, his earlier observations about Evelyn's unusual qualities seeming increasingly significant. James attempted to diffuse the tension. "Mrs. Harrow, no one here suggested any impropriety regarding your unfortunate fire. These things happen in frontier territories. The offer stands as a gesture of community support during your difficult time." Evelyn's lips curved into what might technically be called a smile, though it held no warmth. "How charitable." She glanced around the table, her gaze lingering briefly on each man before returning to James. "I'll need time to consider your proposal." This was clearly not the response the Blackridges had anticipated. Nathan's scowl deepened, while James struggled to maintain his affable facade. "Of course," James managed, though his tone tightened. "I should mention that with winter approaching, the offer may not remain open indefinitely. Construction seasons are brief in this territory." "I'm well aware of Montana's seasons, Mr. Blackridge," Evelyn replied. "I've survived 7 winters here already. I expect I can manage a few more days of consideration before deciding my property's fate." With that, she turned and walked toward the bar, where she spoke briefly with the bartender before he handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper, evidently the real purpose of her visit to the saloon. As she moved toward the exit, Crow rose from his chair and followed, maintaining a discreet distance. Evelyn paused at the door, turning slightly. "Mr. Crow?" she acknowledged without looking back. "There's no need to follow me to the boarding house. I have no intention of leaving town tonight." Crow stopped, genuine surprise crossing his normally impassive features. He hadn't made a sound, and she hadn't glanced back once to see him following. Evelyn left the saloon, doors swinging closed behind her, and conversation gradually resumed, though with a subdued quality, as patrons processed the unexpected confrontation. Crow returned to the table, his expression thoughtful. "She knew I was behind her," he said, settling back into his chair. "Never looked back but knew exactly who was following, and how far." Sheriff Tanner chuckled nervously. "Lucky guess. Had to be one of you boys." "No." Crow shook his head slowly. "She knew my step, identified me specifically." Nathan slammed his glass down. "What are you suggesting? That the chicken farmer's wife is some kind of woodland sprite?" "She got lucky." James, however, was regarding Crow with increased attention. "You mentioned her tracks earlier. Different, you said." Crow nodded. "She moves like someone who knows how to move without being heard. Recognizes sounds others wouldn't notice." He leaned forward. "The package she collected, gunpowder. I smelled it." This information changed the atmosphere at the table. Sheriff Tanner looked distinctly uncomfortable now. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he began. "Lots of legitimate reasons for a homesteader to need gunpowder." "After having her property burned down?" James asked quietly. "When's she supposedly considering selling?" Nathan dismissed these concerns with a sharp gesture. "She's a woman alone who feels vulnerable. Probably wants protection while she decides to accept our offer, which she will." He fixed Crow with a hard stare. "But as a precaution, I want to know everything about Evelyn Harrow. Where she came from, what she did before marrying that school teacher. Every detail." Crow nodded once, understanding the assignment. James tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "We should also accelerate our timeline for the Oakwood Pass operation. If federal marshals are in the area, waiting until the scheduled date would be unwise." "Agreed," Nathan said. "Notify the men. We move tomorrow night instead." As the Blackridges continued their planning, Crow's thoughts remained on Evelyn Harrow. Something about her didn't fit the narrative of a simple settler's widow. The controlled way she moved, the awareness of her surroundings, the calm assessment in her eyes when she'd looked at each of them. Not with fear, but with something that had seemed almost like calculation. Later that night, while the rest of the gang celebrated their anticipated victory over drinks and card games, Crow slipped out of the saloon and made his way to the small territorial records office. The lock on the back door posed little challenge to someone with his skills. Inside, he lit a small lantern and began searching through property records and marriage licenses until he found what he was looking for: the documentation of Robert and Evelyn Harrow's purchase of their ranch 5 years earlier. The record showed Robert Harrow had previously been a school teacher in Denver, but Evelyn's background was notably sparse. Just a brief mention that she had come from Wyoming. No details about family, no previous property ownership, nothing to indicate her life before marrying Robert Harrow. Crow's instincts, honed through years of tracking both animals and men across the frontier, told him this lack of information was significant. People didn't appear out of nowhere, especially not women with the particular skills he suspected Evelyn Harrow possessed. He continued searching until he found a small newspaper clipping filed with their land claim, a brief announcement of their arrival in the territory. The article mentioned Robert Harrow's background as an educator, then added a single line that made Crow freeze. "Mrs. Harrow is known in Wyoming Territory as an accomplished guide and tracker, having led numerous expeditions through the Bighorn Mountains." Crow carefully replaced the records and slipped out of the office, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just a rancher's widow. This was a woman who knew the wilderness, who understood tracking and hunting, who possessed exactly the skills needed to be dangerous to men who had wronged her. As he made his way back to the saloon, Crow found himself reassessing the Blackridge's dismissal of Evelyn Harrow as a threat. Nathan's confidence stemmed from never having faced an opponent like her before. Someone who understood patience and precision, who knew how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Crow paused in the street, looking toward the Wilson boarding house, where a single light still burned in an upstairs window. For the first time since joining the Blackridge gang, he felt a shadow of doubt about their inevitable success. Behind that lit window, Evelyn Harrow sat at a small desk, methodically cleaning her rifle. The pieces were laid out precisely on a cloth, each one receiving careful attention before being reassembled with practiced hands. On the desk beside her lay the package of gunpowder she'd collected from the saloon, along with several other supplies she'd gathered throughout the day. Her confrontation with the Blackridges had served its purpose, establishing her as appropriately distressed but pragmatic, a widow considering her limited options rather than someone plotting revenge. But more importantly, it had given her the opportunity to observe them closely, to study their dynamics and hierarchies, to identify the weaknesses she would exploit in the days to come. Their overconfidence would be their downfall. They saw a woman alone and assumed vulnerability. They didn't recognize a predator assessing her prey. Evelyn reassembled her rifle with swift, sure movements, then tested the action, smooth and silent, ready for tomorrow's work. She had confirmed through careful eavesdropping at the general store that the gang was planning something at Oakwood Pass. Now, after seeing their reaction to the mention of federal marshals, she was certain their timeline would change. They would move sooner rather than later, and she would be waiting. The morning sun had yet to break over the eastern ridge when Evelyn slipped out the back door of the Wilson boarding house. The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as she made her way through Pinewood Falls, avoiding the main street where, even at this early hour, someone might be stirring. Martha Wilson believed Evelyn was still asleep, exhausted from the trauma of losing her home, a perception Evelyn had carefully cultivated by leaving a lump of strategically arranged pillows beneath her blankets. Frost crunched softly beneath her boots as she moved through back alleys toward the livery stable where she'd arranged to keep her horse, a sturdy mountain gelding named Thunder that had been grazing in the far pasture when the Blackridges burned her ranch. Evelyn had located him the morning after the fire and brought him to town, another piece of her life salvaged from the ashes. The stable boy, barely 14, was already awake and tending to the morning feed when Evelyn arrived. Tommy Phillips was the youngest of 6 children, working every odd job he could find to help support his family after his father had been injured in a mining accident the previous year. "Morning, Mrs. Harrow," he greeted quietly, recognizing her need for discretion. "Got Thunder saddled like you asked. Added extra oats too, no charge." "Thank you, Tommy," Evelyn replied, pressing a coin into his palm, double his usual fee. "Remember what we discussed?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Yes'm. If anyone asks, you took Thunder out for a ride yesterday afternoon and haven't returned him yet. Gone to visit your husband's grave to pay respects, I reckon." Evelyn smiled faintly. Tommy had a natural gift for embellishing stories, just enough to make them believable without overplaying the details. "Perfect. I should return by nightfall, but if I don't worry about the horse," Tommy assured her. "My pa always said you were the best guide in the territory before you settled with Mr. Harrow. If anyone can handle themselves out there, it's you." This unexpected acknowledgement of her past caught Evelyn off guard. Most in Pinewood Falls knew her only as Robert Harrow's quiet wife, her previous life as a guide and tracker forgotten or unknown. She studied the boy with renewed interest. "Your father knew me from before?" Tommy nodded. "Worked security for the Anderson mining expedition in '73. Said you tracked a mountain lion that had been picking off their stock when no one else could find it. Pa said you moved like you were part ghost." Evelyn's expression softened momentarily at the memory. "Samuel Phillips. I remember him. Good man with a rifle." She adjusted her pack. "Please give him my regards." "Yes," Tommy agreed, then added hesitantly. "Pa also said if you ever needed anything, after what happened to your place, our family stands ready to help. No love for the Blackridges in our household."